Hi, and welcome to another video in the FieldServer QuickStart series brought to you by Sierra Monitor Corporation. My name is Mac, and today I plan to show you around our FieldServer Graphical User Interface, otherwise known to us as the GUI. This video assumes you've already had a look at our QuickStart tutorial on getting connected to your FieldServer product and is applicable to both the FieldServer X30 and QuickServer products. So let's take a look at what greets you when you connect to the GUI. On the left hand side you have the navigation pane with all the different nodes, and then you have on the right hand side information for each of the nodes. In the root navigation node you have all the information related to the field servers, so BIOS versions, etc., and it may or may not be useful to you depending on what kind of troubleshooting you're doing. We also have in the next tab the settings tab, which gives you all the settings in the field server that are either set up here in the GUI or in the configuration file itself. And finally you have the info stats tab, which will give you the restart count on the field server, and that may be useful as well. Now the other node you want to look at is the user messages node, where you have the ability to have a look at errors on their own. And if you have a look here, there's a configuration file error on this field server. And you can also look at the info tab, which will just give you information about the field server, no errors in that tab. And then you have a driver tab, which will give you information that the drivers are spitting out. And then finally you can look at the combined messages with all of three previous tabs put in one screen if that's more interesting to you. Now let's take a look at what it takes to get your field server set up. In the setup menu you will find the file transfer option, which is where you're going to be spending a lot of time loading configurations into your field server when you're doing your configuration file. In order to grab your configuration file, it's as simple as choose files, browse to your file that you need to grab, and then hit submit, and that'll transfer the file down into the field server. Now when you're done with that, you need to remember that you have to reboot the field server before it's actually using the configuration that you've loaded. So the little black bar at the top is there to remind you that, hey, you still need to hit system restart before the configuration is active. The system restart button can be found at the bottom here, the blue button. Once you hit system restart, it will reboot the field server and you can just wait for it to come back up again. So we're not going to reboot now. We're going to move on and take a look at a few of the other options before we do that. One of the other things you can do in this menu is download firmware if you've been given firmware to update. So firmware files are different from configuration files, and we have a different tab for that. So again, the concept is the same. You choose your file, you hit submit, and yes, you're going to have to do a system restart as well. The general tab is for updating any kind of file that is not configuration or firmware, and sometimes that is necessary, very seldom needed, but it's there for those times when you actually do need it. So let's move on, have a look at the network settings tab. And in the network settings menu you have the ability to actually change your IP address, and we're not going to do that now. I don't want to lose connection to the field server, but again, the concept is the same. This looks very much the same as any kind of network settings you would do on your laptop, and you just enter the values here. Once you're done with entering it, you're going to have to push the update IP settings button at the bottom here, and then once again will require restart. Now the one thing that's different here to what you normally see on your laptop when changing IP addresses is that we have two options on each Ethernet port called the DHCP client state and the DHCP server state, and that's if you want to enable the field server as a DHCP client or as a DHCP server. As a DHCP server, it would actually provide some basic IP address provision to any client that's connecting to the field server. Discussing this in detail is beyond the scope of this particular video, but you can find more information on that in the documentation. Please take note, this is an X30 that I'm actually connected to, so you will see that there are two Ethernet ports to be configured. Now the third menu item in the setup is for setting up a password for the field server. If you feel the need to password protect your field server so that nobody can load configurations or fetch configurations, you can do that using this option, Again, that's beyond the scope of what we're discussing here. This is where you would actually do it. Now let's move on and have a look at the view options in the GUI, and this is where we start getting into troubleshooting and having a look at our communications. We've set up the field server, we've got it all working the way we think it should be working, and now we're going to check to see if we're actually getting communications. I want to take you through the statistics first, and that involves going through the connections section, the node section, and the map descriptors section. These three sections work together in a hierarchy, and that allow you to basically look at statistics for communications and establish just where your issues are coming. So let's have a look at connections to see what I'm going on about. If you have a look at this, it shows you the two connections that are made on this particular field server. One is for Modbus TCP and the other one's for BACnet IP. So when we talk about connections, we're talking about the physical port or network that we're connected on. So you can see that we're not really communicating on the BACnet IP here, but we are doing so on Modbus. Now just to go across the top and show let you know what the columns are. The index and name are self-explanatory, but the TX message stands for transmitted messages and RX message stands for received messages. We also have transmitted characters and received characters being displayed, but they're not that useful to the average user, but the errors side is. So you want to look at transmitted messages, received messages, and errors. You'll see in this application, once again I chose one with errors, that we have 9,000 messages being transmitted here, 333 errors and counting. Now you can drill down into this a bit and try and see what the errors are by clicking onto the Modbus TCP connection, and then you have tabs that will tell you how your connection is set up, what the information is, which is what we saw in the overview there in terms of the communication statistics, and then finally the error statistics broken down. So we have a total of 345 errors, 346 counting, and they're all connect timeouts, which basically means we're not communicating to a device. So it's nice to be able to see that, but this is at the connection level. If we're talking to multiple devices, how do we know where these errors are coming from, which device? And so we go down to the node section to have a look at the same statistics but broken down by device. So here we have a whole bunch of devices, and we will see that we are communicating here with no errors to the first group of devices and absolutely no transmit receive and all errors done on the bottom level of devices. So I know immediately by looking at this that hey, I'm doing fine on the HMD01 devices, but my HMD-R1 devices are simply not communicating. So it's a really useful means of being able to drill down and actually do some fault finding. Now map descriptors, we're starting to get a little technical in terms of naming. These are simply mappings that we do in the configuration, but for each device we might have multiple mappings, and so you can actually go and down and look at the mapping level to see what your error breakdown is, to see if it's a certain mapping that's causing issues for you. In this particular example, our errors were at the node level, so this is not providing me with a lot of information, but it could. So this is a really powerful feature in the field server, and I encourage you to use it a lot. Now the one item I haven't discussed yet is the data raise. The data raise is where we store our data in the field server, and the data raise screen here allows us to first of all get an overview of all the different data rays that are declared in the field server that we're storing data in. And a very useful statistic on the right hand side here is the data age, because it tells us which data rays are actually being updated. As you can see from this, the first two data rays are being updated, the last three are being updated, but these two, index 2 and 3, not being updated, so we know there's no information going into those data rays. Now if you want to know what's inside of these data rays, what's being stored, you can actually go and look inside. Now this application actually isn't really transferring any useful data, so we're seeing a whole bunch of zeros, but we know from the data age that the zeros are coming from the remote device. So a lot of useful statistics that help us to troubleshoot, to see the information that we're actually transferring in the application, and to basically help us with getting in the middle of a communication network and really fault find. And those are the most important things you need to know to work your way around this interface. I just want to show you, just to close up the conversation, how we go about doing this system restart. Let's go back to our setup screen when file transfer to get our system restart button. And if I hit the system restart now, it's actually going to make sure that you want to do it. So you're going to have a confirmation page, and then it's going to tell you that it's going to restart, and then it restarts. And what you need to watch here is that you do actually lose connection with the web browser interface, and so it gives you a message saying server connection lost while it's rebooting. And when it comes back, it'll actually refresh your screen and you'll be able to carry on working. Now, the one thing you do need to take care of and be careful about is that when you change the IP address settings on this GUI and then reboot your field server, you'll still be sitting with the IP address settings up here of your old IP address, and so you really need to close out your browser and use your toolbox to open up the new IP address itself. So this one comes back automatically because I didn't change the IP address, but it's as straightforward as that. And that is the end of this quick start presentation. Please like us below if you found this useful, and let us know in the comments if there are any other features or functions you'd like to see a video on. Thank you, and all the best with your FieldServer application.